Amen. All right, as we do, we've been studying this week, of course, in Mark, reading our 5 chapters a day. And I know it gets tougher and tougher. It's always exciting when you first start out, but sometimes as you go through things, it gets a little bit more difficult to do things. Stick with it. Don't give up. Read those 5 chapters each day. And I'm looking forward to about November at some point. And not that I'm trying to rush time. It'll be here too fast anyway. But I want to be great when we can sit there and say, man, we did it. We read the Bible through 5 times or 7 times, whichever program you're following. We read the New Testament through 7 times this year. Now that will be an accomplishment. And if you think about it, it might be one of your best accomplishments of your life. It's hard to beat reading the Bible, especially doing it 7 times in 1 year. All right, so in this reading this week, as I've done, picked out my favorite things. That's what's good about being the teacher. You get to do that. We did have one question submitted this week, and so it just so happened that was going to be one of the things I was going to be discussing anyway. However, the person that brought it up pointed out something, even though I was going to be teaching on it, that I hadn't noticed. And so we'll answer that question when we get there. But in Mark chapter 8, verses 11 through 13, and I did this a little bit in the men's class, although we didn't have a whole lot of time to get into it in great detail. But I want us to notice something, and this is one of the things that stuck out with me in my reading. As we say, every week it seems like we have people who haven't been in the class. We have Richardson's with us today. He's going to be doing the invitation. The more times you read it, you start seeing things that you maybe have never noticed before. And in Mark chapter 8, remember there he fed the 4,000. This is a different time, of course, than the feeding of the 5,000 because he talks about that. Matter of fact, his disciples, were wondering, how are we going to do this again? And Jesus kind of lets them have it just a little bit. He had compassion on them. Verse 2, verse 3, if I send them away hungry to their own houses, they will faint in the way. Then his disciples answered him, how can one satisfy these people with bread here in the wilderness? And verse 5, he asked them, how many loaves do you have? And he said 7. He commanded the multitude to sit down. And we, of course, have read that. Had a few small fish. Verse 8, they all ate and were filled. They took up 7 large baskets. Now those who had eaten were about 4,000. He sent them away. He immediately got into the boat with his disciples and came to the next region. Then verse 11, this is the part where I want to talk about. Then the Pharisees came out and began to dispute with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven, testing him. But he, and here's the part that I noticed, sighed deeply in his spirit. What's the King James say there? Does it say in his spirit as well?
Yeah.
Okay. Sighed deeply in his spirit. Notice when we read, and I love adjectives, I love adverbs and things like that, descriptive things, because it doesn't just say that he sighed, but he sighed deeply. And then it doesn't just say that he sighed deeply, but it tells them just how deeply it affected him. Where did the sigh come from? Came in his spirit. In his spirit. Did you notice that as we read that? So I want us to think about this, and I know you know what a sigh is, but just imagine our Savior doing this, and his disciples come up to him, the Pharisees rather come to him, and are seeking a sign from heaven, and the first thing he does before he speaks is, yeah. Now, no doubt you've sighed before, especially if you have children. You've sighed multiple times. My mother was the queen of sighing because she had me as a child, I'm sure. But we've sighed a lot of times. Sometimes those sighs are just surface sighs, aren't they? Our kid does something and the toys are all over the room. But then there's other times in life where something strikes you to your core, and it's a much deeper sigh. you lose somebody or something so valuable to you, and before you can even speak, it's that deep sigh, and it's like, well, now what am I going to do? But notice what it says about our Lord. He sighed deeply in his spirit. So let's get the background. Jesus had just returned from the western shores of Galilee. The Pharisees began to dispute with him. They challenged him before. Let's go back to our previous reading from last week, Mark chapter 2, the week before actually, verses 6 and 7. And I'll read these just to move us along a little bit quicker. Some of the scribes were sitting there and reasoning in their hearts, why does this man speak blasphemies like this? Who can forgive sins but God alone? Drop down to verse 16. And when the scribes and Pharisees saw him eating with the tax collectors and sinners, they said to his disciples, how is it that he eats and drinks with tax collectors and sinners? Go to Mark chapter 3, verse 22. You see him again. And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, he was of Beelzebub, and by the ruler of demons he casts out demons. And then Mark chapter 7, verses 1 and 2. So this is not the first time that he's dealt with them. Then the Pharisees and some of the scribes, this is verses 1 and 2, Mark 7. The Pharisees and some of the scribes came together to him, having come from Jerusalem. Now when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is, with unwashed hands, they found fault. And so this is not the first time he deals with them, but there is something interesting here, because he sighs deeply before he talks with them. And so it involved a sigh. Chapter 8, verse 12. Did a little bit of just light study on this. And Hendrickson says the anguish which Jesus experienced came from deep down inside him, within his spirit. And then he went on to say, here the word spirit is used in a sense not much different from heart or inner being. So this didn't come just from a surface side, if you follow what I'm trying to say there. It was something deep within his spirit, deep within his heart, deep within the very core of his being. He sighs. The Savior's sigh. Man, that would make a sermon, wouldn't it? The Savior's sigh. Now, I'll ask you this question. I don't expect an answer yet, because I want to just read a little bit more. Well, what do you think, just in your mind, as you try to paint this picture, what do you think was all involved? And of course, we can't know some of these things, but just trying to understand a little bit more. What do you think was all involved in that sigh? Why do that? Why was it so deep? And why did it come from his inner being, from his spirit? Let's look at a couple other places. In Mark chapter 3, verse 5. And we have some similar reactions. It doesn't say that he sighed, but it does kind of tell us, I think, what he might have been feeling when he made that deep sigh. Mark chapter 3, verse 5. And when he had looked around at them with anger, being grieved by the hardness of their hearts, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was restored, as whole as the other. What's it say there? What descriptive term do we have?
Grieved.
Being grieved by the hardness of their hearts. Look at Mark chapter 7.
They were kicking him, yeah.
That's right. And here's the thing. Let's read this one first. Mark chapter 7, verse 34. That's right. And then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. Well, what caused it there? You just go down and you read that context, but he sighed at that point as well. And then look at John chapter 11, verse 33. And I know you know this account very, very well. This is when Lazarus is dead. John 11, verse 33. Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in his spirit. You see, there's that phrase again, in his spirit, and was troubled. Well, what was the occasion here? He saw her weeping, and the Jews with her weeping, and then what was the result? He groaned in his spirit. So he grieved, he sighed, he groaned. And then in Luke chapter 19, when he went by Jerusalem, as he was going towards the cross, he looks at the city and weeps over them. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. So we go back to Mark chapter 8 with that sighing deeply and couple that with the grieving by the hardness of their hearts. You know, if I came to you and I challenged you every day, or if you came to me, let's make it, since this is, let's put the negative on you, let's put the negative on me, because I can make myself look bad. I don't feel as guilty doing that. But if you came to me every day and you challenged me, every single day, or just every time you saw me, you came up and you challenged me, well, Mark, those shoes don't match your pants. Get behind just in case they don't. That jacket doesn't match your shirt. I don't like the way your hair is. I don't like the way you teach. I don't like this. I don't like that. I don't like the car you drive. But just every time, or if it was just every time you saw me, you had something against me. When I sighed, I think I just lost my microphone. When I sighed, what do you think that sigh would be from? Do you think it would be out of a concern for you? Or more so, oh man, I don't want to see that person right now. And see, that's why I put it on myself instead of you. I guarantee what it would be. Oh man, not her again, not him again. I've had about enough of that person. But was that Jesus' reaction? Is that why he sighed? Why did he sigh? Those other verses really help, don't they? He sighed because of the hardness of their hearts. These people were lost. And as long as they kept that attitude, they would never be saved. And that caused him to sigh deeply within his heart. It says something about our Savior, doesn't it? Yes, sir.
Same reason before they make the promised land. So it's like these people were they ever. And I'm saying to myself too, side of
that's in our men's class. We asked that question. We went a little bit deeper than we have time to go tonight. But we asked the question yesterday: what do you suppose would make Jesus sigh deeply today? And I had a list already ready, but the men really contributed a lot yesterday in the class, and we came up with a pretty good list, and it's probably an exhaustive list. But then we asked the question, I wonder how many times he sighed at me. And I don't want to cause him grief, do you? I don't want to cause him pain and hurt. God help us not to have hearts like this.
But Mark, he also showed frustration.
Oh yeah. He did, absolutely.
Especially when
Because what happened is that he was angry, groaned, and yelled.
especially when the apostles couldn't get the demon out of that man. Said, hey, how long do I have to be with you?
Which brings us to our next point. Perfect. I didn't tell him to say that, but that's a perfect segue. Let's go now to Mark chapter 9. Right, what Brother Bob was talking about. When Jesus heals this deaf mute boy. This is where it comes back into play. And this is where the question that was asked by Edwina Woody asked a great question. And in Mark chapter 9, starting with verse 14, let me just read this. I know you've already read it 7 times, but let's read it one more time. Starting with verse 14, and when he came to the disciples, he saw a great multitude around them and scribes disputing with them. Immediately when they saw him, all the people were greatly amazed, and running to him, greeted him. And he asked the scribes, what are you discussing with them? Then one of the crowd answered and said, Teacher, I brought you my son who has a mute spirit, and wherever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. So I spoke to your disciples that they should cast it out, but they could not. Now stop right now for just a second. What was he coming down from? He came down from the mount. What was that? The mount of what? Transfiguration. And he had three of his disciples up there. Does anybody remember who they were? That's right, James, John, and Peter. Or Peter, James, and John. You threw me off when you said it out of order. Peter, James, and John. And just about any time when you only see just a few disciples, if you guess Peter, James, and John, you're going to be right. That was his three. So he comes down from this great event when God speaks from heaven, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him." So he comes down from the mountain, and here's this multitude, and there's a discussion going on. Jesus says, "What are you discussing with them?" The crowd answered and said, "Teacher, I brought you my son who has a mute spirit." And we all read that. "So I spoke to your disciples that they should cast it out, but they could not." Now watch, as Brother Bob pointed out. He answered him and said, "O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me." And they brought him to him, and when he saw him, immediately the spirit convulsed, and he fell on the ground and wallowed, foaming at the mouth. So he asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. And often he has thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." Did you notice something there? If you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. Verse 23, Jesus said to him, "If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes." Immediately the father of the child cried out, and with tears, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." And when Jesus saw the people come running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "Deaf and dumb spirit, I command you to come out of him." And then here's the question that went ahead, and I didn't notice this part, "and enter him no more." So her question was, if a demon was cast out, could it go back into the person? Have you ever thought about that? And there's some interesting observations on that. And took a little bit more study. As a matter of fact, I told her, I said, "You know what? I'll get back to you on that." And preachers, that's the best answer you can give sometimes when you don't know something. Don't make something up. Let me get back to you on that. And so that's what we had to do. But we're going to look at a couple of places here, but let's just go down through this. There's a couple other occasions where this is talked about. Let's just finish the reading here. "And the spirit cried out, convulsed him greatly, and came out of him, and he became as one dead, so that many said, he is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand, lifted him up, and he arose. And when he had come into the house, his disciples asked him privately, Why could we not cast it out? So he said to them, This kind can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting. Man, there's just so much here from this. It's powerful. But notice, first of all, the failure of the disciples. He finds his disciples embroiled in controversy. It appears related to their inability to heal a man's deaf, mute son. Jesus chides the disciples for their lack of faith. And as the boys brought to Jesus, he has a spirit-induced seizure. And the father describes how this has happened often since his childhood, and he begs for compassion. But then he says, Lord, if you are able to do anything, why do you think he might come to Jesus with that kind of attitude? You bring him to the disciples of Jesus because you believe they can, and then you see the master himself. Why would he phrase it that way? If you can do anything. And let me ask you this. If you went to the doctor after a chronic problem that you were having, and he treated you for a while and it never got any better, and he said, well, you know what, I can't do anything with you. Let me send you to another doctor. What kind of attitude are you going to go into with if that first doctor couldn't do anything? You're not going to be able to do anything either, but I've got to give it a try. Especially if that happened 2 or 3 or 4 times. By the time you get to that next doctor, you know, this is just a waste of time and money. He's not going to be able to do anything. Well, the disciples of Jesus could not cast out the spirit from his son. And so it says, if you can do anything, that's right, have compassion, begs for compassion, if you can do anything. And so just imagine this chaotic scene, the disciples' frustration, the father's emotions, his frustration, all of this going on. And so then Jesus responds to the plea of the father in verses 23 and 24. If the father can believe, all things are possible. if you can believe. Question, did Jesus always require belief or faith when he performed a miracle? No. Can you give me an example of at least one where he didn't? Lazarus, he's dead. Lazarus, he's dead.
Okay.
Who else?
Man with the palsy,
Say it again.
that man they let down had the palsy.
That's right. The man that let down from the roof.
Yeah.
Children. There's several of them actually. He didn't always require faith, did he? Yes.
I don't think about when you was talking about the doctor, but I took from that from when the man was saying if you can, because said like the doctor said, well, the man taught me, and that's the reason why I thought maybe he took that because Jesus they was his followers, and if your followers didn't do this, and they following you.
Absolutely. Makes you doubt him. Ooh, that's a good lesson too, Sister Dale. They doubted. Maybe he doubted Jesus because he had been seeing his followers.
Right.
And can the followers of Christ today cause people to doubt Jesus? Ooh, that's good. That's really good. And that's a great point. And if you can believe, and so the Father professes faith, but then what does he do? And I love this. Lord, I believe, and then what? Help my unbelief. Help me believe more. I do believe, but help me believe more. And I've heard this man condemned by some who read this as someone who didn't have enough faith, who lacked faith. But boy, I sure don't read it that way. Here's a man who's honest. And if I'm honest, there's so many times I could have said this exact phrase. I do believe, but help my unbelief.
He did help.
Sincere.
Absolutely. When you think about what this man is going through,
Yeah.
I do believe, help my unbelief. And so the demon was cast out with a great convulsion, leaving the boy dead like. Jesus takes the boy by the hand and lifts him up, and the boy rises. And then Jesus privately informs the disciples as to the reason, and we'll get to that if we have some time. But let's look at a couple things as to Edwina's question. Look at Matthew chapter 12, 43 and 45. This doesn't give me all the answers I want, but it gives me more than I had. Matthew chapter 12, look at verse 43. When an unclean spirit goes out of a man, he goes through dry places seeking rest and finds none. Then he says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when he comes, he finds it empty, swept, and put in order. Then he goes and takes with him 7 other spirits more wicked than himself, and they enter and dwell there. And the last state of that man is worse than the first. So shall it also be with this wicked generation. Jesus is making the point there. He allowed the devil in once. He's cast out. But then you get worse and you allow 7 times the spirit to get in there, and the end is worse than just having the one spirit. Incidentally, how many spirits did Mary Magdalene have in her? Do you remember? Somebody said it's 7.
There was one, so they called him Legion.
That's right. That was the man of Gergesenes.
Yeah.
Mary Magdalene had 7. Now just imagine if one could cast you into the fire, almost drown you. Imagine what it would be like to have 7. And then look at one more passage, Luke chapter 11. Like I said, this doesn't give me all the answers I want, but I think it does show that a spirit could re-enter. Or else, why would Jesus say, enter him no more? Luke 11, verse 24 through 26. When an unclean spirit goes out of a man, he goes to dry places seeking rest and finding none. He says, I will return to my house from which I came. When he comes, he finds it swept and put in order. He goes and he takes with him 7 other spirits more wicked than himself, and they enter and dwell there. And the last state of that man is worse than the first. So I think the answer is yes. They could re-enter, which is something I had never really thought about before. Had you? That was a great question. Yes, ma'am.
When it says 7, I don't know if it's stupid, but when it says 7 others, does that make it 8?
That's a good question. Yeah, I would say it does, yeah. You know, 7 is that perfect number we read about a lot, and so yeah, I think it's 7 plus 1. That's 8. That's,
Well, of course, you know, they have the thing of the spirit has to be left from the body and enter the
into the pigs,
into the
yeah.
pigs.
They had to have a body, didn't they?
They had to have a body.
A pig's body, I guess, is better than no body
Yeah.
until they go off the cliff. Then you're right back where you were started. All right, let's get to this. We got about 5 minutes, 6 minutes, and I want to talk about this. We started to get into this in our men's class, but we just didn't have enough time. In this, you know, we got to avoid some misapplication where Jesus says to him, if you believe all things are possible. Some people take that and run all over the place with it. If you believe that anything is possible, like you can literally move a mountain. I don't know if you remember, this is back in the 90s is how long ago it was, but I remember watching on television this little boy whose mother and him, I don't think his father was still living or they weren't together, whatever the case, this boy was born without an arm. And his mother was one of these that truly believed in those faith healers on television. And people like him. And it wasn't Benny Hinn, but it was somebody just like Benny Hinn. And they were having a revival or something, whatever they call them, faith healing thing, in Orlando, Florida. And this mother and her son, she had taken him and tried to get into different places. When they got to this one in Orlando, Florida, you know, because she really, really, really believed. And so did her son. But they would never let him in. And finally they had to admit, because there's nothing we can do for your son. And they were devastated. You know, and they believed so much. And so you can kind of take that and you can run with it. Well, that's not true. There's a lot of times, you know, you can believe all you want, but if it's not according to God's will, you know, I believe I deserve $1 million. I can believe all that I want, but if I just stand here and wait for it, unless Marv's going to give me a loan. I don't want a loan. I want a gift. Let me take that back. That's right. That's right. And I like what this one writer said. All things are possible, but they must be on the menu. I like that, don't you? All things are possible, but they must be on the menu. I want to get to the part here about the fasting. All things are, these types of things are possible just with fasting and prayer. Well, of course, we know the power of faith that it has in here. If you believe, all things are possible. But then the power of prayer also. Our faith, and think about this statement, our faith, while very important, is not always sufficient. God must be involved, and so that's where prayer comes in. Your faith alone cannot get you through some things in life. Is that right or wrong? There's some things in life that just your faith alone needs more. One of those things is prayer. But then Jesus also adds something here as well, and fasting. And we don't hear that talked about much, do we?
Well, you do that.
Yeah, you do not. To lose weight, intermittent fasting, that's true. That's true. And let's look at a couple places here with the time that we have left. Look at Ezra chapter 7, or chapter 8. Ezra chapter 8. Fasting was often joined with prayer to incur God's favor. And here's a question I want you to ask until the bell rings. Oh, Marion's opening up. Here's the question I want you to ask. Has this changed, or is this just Old Testament stuff, or do these principles no longer apply? Ezra chapter 8, starting with verse 21. Then I proclaimed a fast there at the river of Ahava, that we might humble ourselves before our God to seek from Him the right way for us and our little ones and all our possessions, for I was ashamed to request of the king and escort the soldiers, the horsemen, and so on and so forth. Verse 23, so we fasted and entreated our God for this, and He answered our prayer. So they had faith and they had prayer, but what do they add to this?
They had to be humble.
They had to be humble. And what part does fasting have to do with that, if anything? Let's look at another passage while we're going with this. Look at Psalm 35. This goes right along with what Miss June just said. She said it had to be humble. And I asked, what part does fasting have to play with that? Look at Psalm 35, verse 13. I'm not saying we're like the Pharisees who commanded people to fast twice in a week and all of these things. Look at Psalm 35, verse 13. But as for me, when they were sick, my clothing was sackcloth. I humbled myself with what? With fasting. Look at Psalm 69, verse 10. Psalm 69, verse 10. When I wept and chastened my soul with fasting, that became my reproach. And then if you read other passages, let me just give you these. You can study these on your own. Isaiah 57, verse 15. This humility is more likely to incur God's favor when we approach Him with humility. So that connection between humility and fasting. Thus people often serve God with fasting and prayer. Let's think about this. What did Jesus do before He chose the apostles? He prayed. What did the church in Antioch do before they sent out Paul and Barnabas? They prayed, but what else did they do? You ever read that? They fasted. So my question is this just an Old Testament thing and something that was just available and just smart to do or just wise to do during the time when Christ was on the earth or just after He went back to heaven? Or do you think it's something that might be a good idea for us to do today when they're facing a big decision to couple our faith with prayer and maybe abstain from food while we do that? That's right. You don't go and brag about it. That's exactly right. But you think about this, let me just paint a picture, then we'll have to close because we're out of time already. If I put my phone in another part of the house, keep it shut off, if I don't eat anything all day, and I just go to a part of the house or someplace away, and I just take all that time, I'm not eating, I'm not connected to my phone and all of these things, and I spend that time in prayer to God, do you think your thoughts might be a little bit deep? That's right, yeah. That's right. Yeah. Well, we hide it well, don't we, Marv? All right, let's get ready for the